Okay, I'll start by doing homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everyone. First, I have to make some announcement. According to the original schedule, we have a class November 3rd, and then the next one November 17th. But now I have to attend some function on November 17th. But since November 10th is open, then I want to schedule a class on November 10th instead of November 17th. Then also in December, there's one open Saturday, and since I missed the first class, then I also want to schedule a class on that open Saturday, that's December 8th. So we have classes November 3rd, November 10th, then we miss the Thanksgiving, then the next one is December 1st, and December 8th, and December 15th. Okay, today's class, the topic of it is the happiness pertaining to the present life. And early Buddhism is commonly represented by some scholars and interpreters as being exclusively a doctrine of world renunciation aimed at a kind of transcendental liberation. And sometimes it's assumed that early Buddhism has no concern for life in the world and that it doesn't present any teachings that are of value for people living in the world. It's said that sometimes the early Buddhism is a purely monastic form of Buddhism, and that the only duty of the lay people are to observe simple precepts and to support monks and nuns by giving alms. But this is, I consider to be a misrepresentation of the early teachings. So to some extent, I would say that this misrepresentation may be based upon a certain bias that already comes down in the collection of texts that have been preserved for us as the canonical texts. But we have to remember, this is an important point, that the collections of texts, the Nikayas that have come down to us, have been selected, organized, and arranged by monks. And originally at the early councils, entirely by monks, not even by nuns. So these early Buddhist councils were conducted entirely by monks, and at these councils the monks would have selected those teachings, those discourses of the Buddha that they considered to be of special value, to be worth preserving. And so it's therefore possible that a certain monastic bias has governed the choice of the discourses of the Buddha that were to be preserved and considered canonical. But it's very likely, in fact I think it's overwhelmingly probable, that the Buddha gave many discourses that have not been preserved. The Buddha would travel over northeastern India 8 months of the year, all the time except for the 4 months of the rainy season. And as he traveled to the different Indian towns and villages, whenever he stayed at any place for a few days, word was spread about that a wandering ascetic with a very high reputation has stopped by our town and village, and so people would come out to the place where he's staying in order to meet him and to listen to his teachings. And so I think when the Buddha gave discourses to people from the village, people of the town, he would not have dealt primarily or largely with topics of special concern to monastics, but would have explained to people how to live a righteous life, a life in accordance with the Dhamma that is appropriate for their own living situation. His discourses would have touched on various aspects of living in the world, and perhaps even treated these topics in some detail. Okay, because the monks who arranged the canon, who collected the texts, were primarily concerned to preserve the teachings that expound the path to liberation and the practice of the liberating path, we find that the largest proportion of suttas deal with these topics. But when we look carefully at the Nikayas as a whole, not just selecting texts from here and there, we'll also find that there's a substantial number of discourses that are addressed to lay people, dealing with various aspects of ordinary life. These texts, the way they've been formulated, are especially shaped by the social and economic conditions of life in ancient India. And so in some aspects they might seem rather quaint and dated to us. But we can also perceive in these texts universal principles that can be applied to life in any society, even in present-day United States or in Europe. These discourses constitute the teachings that are appropriate for what I call the first level of the Buddha's doctrine. And I call these the teachings that are designed to promote well-being and happiness here and now. If you remember when I explained the scheme of this course in the first day, the first class we had, I explained that there are three, what I distinguish, three levels or three categories of teachings within the whole framework of the Dhamma. Okay, so these three, just to review very briefly, these three levels of teaching. One is, I call this the Dhamma aim to promote welfare and happiness in the present life. Okay, the second level is the Dhamma which is aimed to promote welfare and happiness in future lives. That is, as one has to go on cycling in samsara, the round of birth and death, when these teachings that will guide one to attain a fortunate rebirth and happiness within one's future existences. And then the third level of teaching is the Dhamma aimed at the ultimate good. That is, the teachings that lead to liberation, the teachings that promote, the teachings that explain the path to liberation. And so today we finally enter upon the first level of this threefold scheme. That is, with the aspect of the Buddha's teaching designed to promote well-being and happiness in this present life. Okay, the Buddha's teaching extends to life in the world because in the Buddhist conception, life in the world should also be regulated by the Dhamma. So this brings us to the point, the question, what exactly does this word Dhamma mean? The word Dhamma is the key concept needed to understand the Buddha's teaching. In fact, we call the Buddha's teaching the Dhamma. So the word Dhamma is not something used uniquely in relation to the Buddha's teaching, but in Indian spirituality, the concept of Dhamma has kind of extended meaning so that any kind of spiritual teaching is called a Dhamma, or in Sanskrit, a Dharma. So what does this word Dhamma or Dharma actually mean? The word comes from a root, a Sanskrit root, same in Pali. The root is dar. Okay, so the root dar gives us the verb dharati, or a stronger verb, a positive verb, dharati. And this verb means to support, to sustain, or to uphold. And so the Dhamma means that which upholds, that which sustains. And the Dhamma is called this because in the Indian conception, the Dhamma is that which supports and upholds living beings, especially human beings, which supports them, upholds them, and prevents them from falling down into misery and suffering. It is what prevents them from moral and spiritual degeneration and collapse. The Dhamma is what holds them up, sustains them, supports them, and enables them to evolve on to states of greater happiness, greater wisdom, greater peace, until it leads them to the ultimate realization, the state of total liberation. In the Indian conception, Dhamma is not merely a subjective quality, not merely a practice that one undertakes, but the Dhamma has an even wider, what I call an objective meaning. That is, the Dhamma is the law of the universe, the cosmic law of righteousness and truth. And then derivatively it becomes the teaching which explains, reveals, opens up, elucidates this cosmic law of righteousness, virtue, and truth. It is the law that ensures that wrong behavior and distorted views, that moral transgressions will bring pain and suffering. And it's the law that ensures that wholesome behavior, right conduct, and correct understanding will lead to happiness and well-being. So the Dhamma is this objectively existing law that runs through the universe and also runs through human life. And according to Indian spirituality, the Dhamma should be the guiding principle of human life in every way. All aspects of human life have their own Dhamma, their own guiding principles. And these guiding principles, or Dhammas, relating to different spheres of human life, are reflections, aspects, branches of the universal Dhamma, the universal law of virtue and truth. This cosmic law of virtue and truth is very intimately woven with human life, so that human actions in the Buddhist conception will have effects that extend even to the objective order of events. Some sutras say that when human beings become morally corrupt, then the sky does not send down sufficient rainfall, the sun and moon deviate from their orbits, and then we have droughts and floods and disasters and calamities of different kinds. But when human beings live in accordance with the Dhamma, when they live a life of virtue and goodness, then the weather becomes clement, the sun and moon follow their normal orbits, and humanity becomes prosperous and secure. Perhaps we can even see that happening now with global warming as a result of human beings, through their greed, overexploit the resources of the earth, and then that causes global warming, which in time will bring various calamities and disasters. Okay, through his enlightenment, the Buddha comprehends the entire Dhamma. And so he understands not only the path to enlightenment and liberation, but he understands all the right principles needed to guide human beings along the right way of life, as well as other living beings who are open to his instruction. Therefore, the Buddha is called, in the text, they call him the Dhamma Raja, which means the king of the Dhamma, or Dhamma Sami, Dhamma Swami, the Lord of the Dhamma. In the spiritual sphere, the Buddha is the counterpart of a secular ruler. That type of secular ruler is called the Raja Chakravarti, which means literally the wheel-turning monarch, the wheel-turning king. And in Indian legend, as we find it in Buddhist texts, from time to time there arise in the world these wheel-turning monarchs, or universal monarchs, who through their goodness of character, their inner spiritual strength, are able to conquer the four corners of the world, the four continents, not through force or violence, but wherever they go, other nations submit to them in order to receive their protection, their compassionate guidance, and their effective administration. And so the Buddha is the counterpart in the spiritual domain of the wheel-turning monarch, who is the supreme ruler in the secular domain. In fact, when the Buddha was born, if you remember the traditional legends of the Buddha, the court Brahmins, after examining his body, the body of the baby, when the king asked them what they saw in the signs of the baby's body, they held up 2 fingers. And then the king asked, what is the reason for holding up 2 fingers? And the Brahmins explained, from the signs, the physical features of this newborn baby, we see that there are 2 possible careers open to him. If he doesn't experience or witness the sorrows of life, then he will go on to become what? To become a Chakravarti Raja, the wheel-turning monarch. But if he discovers the sufferings of life, then he will renounce the household life and become a world teacher, one who will pull away the veil of delusion from the world. So for this reason, his father tried to keep him shielded from the sorrows of life, because his father wanted him not to become a religious teacher, but to become a wheel-turning monarch. Okay, we see this aspect of the Buddha's function illustrated in the first text in this chapter. Here we're in chapter 4 and on page 115. Okay, here the Buddha is beginning the discourse, and he declares that even a wheel-turning monarch, the wheel-turning monarch is called, interestingly, it's translated here, just and righteous king. But the Pali words are Dhammika Dhammaraja, which is based on the word Dhamma. Dhammika is the adjective, and Dhammaraja means the king of the Dhamma. But he's also, the Buddha is called Dhammaraja. But they are both kings of the Dhamma in a different way. The wheel-turning monarch is the king of the secular Dhamma, the Dhamma that applies to life in the world, whereas the Buddha is the king of the entire Dhamma, both the Dhamma applying to life in the world and the Dhamma that leads to enlightenment and liberation. So the Buddha says, even this wheel-turning monarch, the Dhammika Dhammaraja, the just and righteous king, the king who rules by the Dhamma, does not govern his realm without a co-regent. The text actually says he doesn't govern his realm without another king above him. And then when he says this, then a monk asks, who is the co-regent, or who is the ruler of the wheel-turning king? Then the Buddha says, it is the Dhamma. And here, the Pali just says Dhamma. The word law of righteousness added is somewhat of an explanatory addition. But then the Buddha goes on to explain how the wheel-turning king rules in accordance with the Dhamma. He says, the just and righteous king, relying on the Dhamma, honoring the Dhamma, esteeming and respecting it, with the Dhamma as his standard, banner, and sovereign, provides lawful protection, shelter, and safety for his own dependents, that's those in the household, for the khatiyas, those are the administrators, the governors who attend on him, for his army, for the Brahmins and householders, for the inhabitants of town and countryside, and for ascetics and Brahmins, and for the beasts and birds. This is quite interesting, that in the Indian conception, the ideal ruler is to protect not only human life and then let human beings go killing animals and birds and fish as they want, but he provides protection, proper protection for all the living beings within his kingdom. And when it's said that the king relies on the Dhamma, honors the Dhamma, esteems the Dhamma, it's not referring explicitly to the Buddha's teaching, because the wheel-turning monarchs often arise during periods when the Buddha's teaching is not known. But even though the Buddha's teaching itself isn't known, but there will be an understanding within society of what are the basic principles of righteousness, virtue, and truth. And so a wheel-turning monarch will understand these principles and will uphold them in his kingdom. And he takes on his responsibility by providing shelter and protection for everybody who lives within his rule, under his rule. He doesn't exploit them as many kings do for his own advantage, doesn't overtax them, but he will always act to promote the welfare and happiness of his subjects. And so the Buddha goes on to say that the wheel-turning monarch, the just and righteous king, is one who rules only by the Dhamma. That is his whole guideline for rulership. And so his rule cannot be overthrown by any enemies or hostile people. In the same way, the Buddha goes on, the Tathagata, the Arhat, the perfectly enlightened one, he is also called the Dhammika Dhammaraja, the just and righteous king of the Dhamma. And he also relies on the Dhamma, honors the Dhamma, esteems and respects the Dhamma. So even the Buddha doesn't exercise any kind of authority arbitrarily. There is a sutta that comes in Anguttara Nikaya, also in Samyutta Nikaya. After his enlightenment, the Buddha was still sitting under the Bodhi tree. And then he reflected that one who lives in the world without anybody to respect, without anybody to venerate, without anybody to learn from as a teacher, lives unhappily. And so the Buddha considered, let me find somebody that I should live in dependence on, that I should seek guidance from, that I should regard as a teacher. And then he considered, is there anybody in this world who has surpassed me with respect to individual conduct, with respect to samadhi, concentration, with respect to wisdom, with respect to liberation, that I could depend upon to perfect my conduct, my samadhi, my wisdom, my liberation. And then the Buddha realized that there's nobody in this world right now who surpasses him in these respects. But the Buddha still wanted somebody to rely on and depend on. And so then he thought, let me rely and depend upon this Dhamma that I have realized, and take this Dhamma itself as my teacher. And so the Buddha therefore continued to live, always looking to the Dhamma as his support, as his teacher, as the object of his respect. And so then the text says that with the Dhamma as his standard, banner, and sovereign, the enlightened one provides lawful protection, shelter, and safety for others. And how does he do so? In regard to action by body, speech, and mind. So he teaches everybody who comes to him seeking instructions. He teaches what kind of bodily actions should be undertaken, what kind of bodily action should be avoided, what kind of speech should be uttered, what kind of speech should be avoided, what kind of mental action or thoughts should be undertaken or permitted, and what kind of thoughts should not be permitted. And so in this way, the Buddha says, the Tathagata, the Arhat, the perfectly enlightened one, provides lawful protection, shelter, and safety in regard to action by body, speech, and mind. And so in this way, he turns the wheel of Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma. And this wheel cannot be turned back by anyone in the world. Okay, and so what the Buddha teaches in his role as king of the Dhamma is proper conduct of body, speech, and mind. And when the Buddha teaches people living within society, then he teaches in quite specific ways according to their situation within society. That is, this one, what I call this one general or universal Dhamma will bring out from itself specific Dhammas, specific codes of conduct that are appropriate for people in their specific situations. We might see this somewhat like the image of the moon reflected in a body of water, or like a lake in which there are many waves. And so this one moon, when it's reflected in the lake, will give the appearance of many moons. Each wave will reflect the moon in its own way, according to its own angle. So as this universal Dhamma becomes intertwined with human activity, it gives rise to many different specific Dhammas, which are the ways of life, the ways of conduct, appropriate for people in their different situations. We can see one example of that in a sutta which is the largest discourse of the Buddha, dealing with the right conduct for a layperson or householder. This sutta is called the Sigalovada Sutta, or sometimes the Sigalaka Sutta. And in the sutta, one time as the Buddha was walking to a village or to a town, he saw outside the town on the road there was a young Brahmin who was bowing down to the different directions. And then the Buddha asked him, "What are you doing?" And the young Brahmin explained that when my father was dying, he asked me to uphold this Brahminic practice of worshipping the 6 directions. So now I'm fulfilling the promise I made to my father to worship the 6 directions. So now this is the way the Buddha teaches very often. He will take an older concept, particularly it might be a concept or a practice that is prevalent in the India of his period, could be something that had been practiced by the Brahmins, taught by the Brahmins, and then he will give it a new interpretation or show how it can be applied in a different way, in a way which will bring out principles that are harmonious with his own teaching. So even the very word Brahmin itself, which in the Buddha's time meant a member of the Brahmin caste, one who has the authority to study the Vedas and to practice the Vedic rituals, especially sacrifice. The Buddha took this word Brahmin and traced it to its original root, which is Brahm, the idea of what is holy and sacred, the holy power or sacred power that becomes manifest in cosmic existence. And then the Buddha redefined the Brahmin as the Arahant, the one who is freed from all defilements, all the bonds of existence, and whose mind has become completely illuminated with higher wisdom and higher knowledge. And there's one poem, it's a kind of narrative poem in the Therigatha, the poems of the elder monks, by a monk whose name was Sunita. Sunita had been an outcast whose job was very early every morning to go to the latrines and to collect the excrement in order to bring it outside the town and deposit it at a place for waste disposal. So in Indian society, he was the lowest of the low. But one day he met the Buddha. And when he met the Buddha was walking down the street, one end of the street. Sunita was coming down the other end of the street with his basket collecting the excrements from the houses. And when Sunita saw the Buddha coming, he was afraid because he considers that I am such a defiled person. And here comes a sadhu, a sannyasi, a holy man. And so, as the Buddha is walking down the street, Sunita goes into an alley and sort of stands against the wall in the alley. Then the Buddha continues down the street, and instead of just passing that alley by, he turns to Sunita and faces him, and Sunita is cringing from fear because he feels that he's not worthy to stand in the presence of this holy and sacred man. But the Buddha knows that deep within Sunita's mind there are many wholesome roots from earlier existences. And so he says to Sunita, why do you continue with this unpleasant work? Wouldn't you like to become a monk? And Sunita thinks, I'm not worthy, how can I become a monk? But the Buddha says, in my teaching, there is no distinction whether one is a Brahmin, a Kshatriya, from any caste or an outcast. Anyone can enter my teaching and practice. And so Sunita then accepts this invitation. He becomes a monk and he learns the practice from the Buddha. And he goes off and meditates very diligently. And within some time, he achieves arhatship. And then in his verse in the Therigatha, he exclaims, he gives his proclamation of victory and triumph, how he's triumphed over all the mind's defilements and has reached the highest knowledge. And then the Buddha speaks a verse praising Sunita. He says that he sees while Sunita is sitting in meditation, then Sakka, who is the king of the Devas, and Brahma, who is the god worshipped by the Brahmins, have come to worship Sunita, formerly an outcast, who through his diligent practice has now made himself superior even to the gods and to the Brahmic deities. And then the Buddha says, he is the Brahman supreme, meaning Sunita, an outcast. He is the true Brahman who has seen his past existences, who sees the arising and passing away of beings, and whose mind is completely free of all corruptions and bonds. Okay, so now coming back to the Sigala Sutta, the Buddha sees this young Brahmin worshipping the six directions, and then when the young Brahmin explains to him what he's doing, the Buddha says, yes, there is that way of worshipping the six directions, but that is not the way we worship the six directions in the teachings of the noble ones. So then the young Brahmin asks, how does one worship the six directions in the teaching of the noble ones? And now the Buddha didn't, in this case, he didn't try to persuade this young Brahmin to become a monk. He must have seen that this young Brahmin was married with family and didn't have the aptitude for becoming a monk. And so he explains to him a different way of worshipping the six directions, a way that is in accordance with his own teaching. And he explains that he takes the idea of six directions and he explains each direction by way of a different relationship that one has in society. There's the eastern direction, which represents the parents. And then he explains the duty of children to their parents. The southern direction are one's teachers. He explains the duties of a student to his teacher. And in each case, he also shows how the other person, when one fulfills one's duty to that person, how that other person or group of people will respond to oneself, treating one compassionately by doing certain things that will be in one's self-interest. Then there's the western direction. That is how, since the Buddha is speaking to a man, how a husband worships the western direction by treating his wife in the appropriate way. Then the wife shows compassion to her husband by reciprocating with certain qualities and actions. The northern direction, that is how one friend relates to his friends and colleagues. The nadir, the lower direction, are one's workers, employees. And so this is how an employer relates to his workers and employees. And then the zenith, the upper direction, those are the ascetics and Brahmins, the religious teachers and guides. So we have that sutta in the book, but I also, just to make it very clear and easy to follow, I laid out the different duties in this handout sheet. I'm not going to go through all of the duties here, that you can read on your own. But also bear in mind that some of these stem from the particular conditions of India during the Buddha's time and might not be applicable today. For example, one of the ways in which parents show compassion to their children is by finding a suitable marriage partner for them. If you're not yet married, if you go to your parents and say, "Mom, Dad, can you help me find a suitable marriage partner?" they will look at you as though you've gone a little bit wacky. But in Asian Buddhist countries like Sri Lanka, it's still quite common for parents to select a partner for their daughter. In order to understand this aspect of Sri Lankan society, this is what one finds in the newspapers. There's a section of the Sunday newspaper where they have the marriage proposals. And so I used to look at these, not that I was seeking a marriage partner, but to understand the society better. So I would look at these on Sunday in the newspaper. Parents seek partner for daughter, age 26, university degree, working at a respectable firm and such. In Sri Lanka they have a caste system, so sometimes they will mention the caste that they come from, and they'll seek a husband from the similar caste. Sometimes they'll say, if they're more enlightened, they'll say caste irrelevant. Okay, but even though some of the specific duties and ways of reciprocating these actions with benevolent action and return, even though some of these are specifically tied to Indian society in the Buddha's time, but there is a general principle running through this teaching on the 6 directions that is applicable, I think, to any society. And this is the idea that society is sustained by a network of interwoven relationships which bring harmony and peace to society. And so when that will bring harmony and peace to society, when people fulfill their responsibilities in a spirit of kindness, sympathy, and goodwill. So individuals that make up society are encouraged to renounce their narrow, ego-centered self-interests and to develop a sincere, warm-hearted concern for the welfare of others and for the good of the greater whole. Maybe if anybody has any questions on anything that I've said so far, then I'll ask if they want to ask now. Yes, please.
Yeah, in walking
Yeah.
I provide a little context and background as to the way that would occur. But I'd always thought that it was by virtue of the Buddha's encounter related to the laws of suffering,
sickness, aging, and death that really promoted or prompted his search, which culminated in his becoming enlightened. But as you presented here, he was otherwise would have been on the path to becoming a world-returning monarch, which means that he also would have been righteous.
Yeah.
Meaning, the encounter with pain, suffering, and death did not lead to his ultimate enlightenment. Was not necessary for his enlightenment. Would that be correct?
No, I would have to say that the encounter with aging, sickness, and death was the necessary stimulus to, let us say, that the Buddha, through his course of his previous lives, had built up all the faculties, all of the inner potentials for attaining Buddhahood. And we could say that was actually his destiny. But this is the way ignorance works, in that in the early part of his life, he didn't have the awareness of his destiny, of that calling to seek the path to enlightenment. It had to take some specific events, specific experiences to break through the layers of ignorance that still covered his mind. And that happened in the legend. That said that he had this encounter, that he didn't know anything about old age, sickness, and death, and he had an encounter with an old man, sick man, and a corpse. So I think this is just a mythical way of showing the psychological process. In his late 20s, he started to reflect deeply on old age, sickness, and death. And then when he fully understood their significance, then his interest in continuing the life of the palace withered away, and then he felt impelled to take the path of renunciation in order to seek the way to enlightenment.
But didn't you say in your remarks that but for that series of encounters, he would have been a world-turning monarch, which means that he would rule righteously, and therefore, I assume, have ruled from a position of enlightenment?
No, he would not have ruled from a position of enlightenment. Because there's a difference between ruling righteously and having enlightenment. And so a wheel-turning monarch is not an enlightened one. He's not the Buddha. He rules virtuously in accordance with what we call the principles of secular righteousness and justice. But he doesn't have a wheel-turning monarch on his own, doesn't know the path that leads to enlightenment and to liberation from the whole round of birth and death. That takes a Buddha to discover.
So essentially, he would have ruled in accordance with level one.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. 1 and 2, of course, they would have also accepted the principle of karma and rebirth.
Thank you.
Yes.
Did we ever have a wheel-turning monarch? Could you say it wouldn't have been Alexander?
No, maybe the closest that would come to this perhaps would be, at least according to the edicts, would be King Ashoka.
That was after Buddha.
He was after the Buddha. Yeah. So he's not officially regarded as a wheel-turning monarch by Buddha's history, but I think he emulated the wheel-turning monarch as his example. Yeah.
But he didn't conquer the four corners.
No. And I think probably the idea of the wheel-turning monarch was probably a concept original to Buddhism. I don't think it existed in Indian theory before the time of the Buddha. And probably the Buddha or the early Buddhists developed this concept. In fact, we're going to come to this in the next class. Somewhat as a counterweight to the consolidation of monarchies which were taking place in India at that time, beginning to develop in a rather ruthless and autocratic way. And this was a way through legend or myth of showing a ruler the ideal according to which he should try to rule.
There are 2 points. The second point is the result of these questions, and that is how many, if any, lay people became archons in the word enlightened.
Yeah.
And because in your answer it seems mutually exclusive, either secular or monastic. But my first question is, when you were discussing Dhamma, the universal law of Dhamma, you used a word which is, for me, loaded. You said it is the cause of the law of consequences of karma. And once you used that word, I was on alert, because if karma has a cause, not the workings of karma, but karma itself has a cause, how is that distinguished from other cause things, such as independent origination? I'm confused.
I don't think I said cause of karma. I just don't have a concept of a cause of karma.
Neither do I, but that's what I learned. I mean, it may just be that you use the word, or my internet.
Yeah, I don't think I would have said the cause of that. Did I say Dhamma is the cause of karma?
You didn't say Dhamma in my recollection. You did not say Dhamma is the cause of karma.
Yeah.
My recollection is that Dhamma is the cause of the sequence of consequences.
Okay, what I would say is that Dhamma is one aspect of Dhamma is the law that ensures that unwholesome actions produce unhappy results and wholesome actions produce pleasant or favorable results. So this is an aspect of Dhamma, is the karmic law. Not that there's a cause for karma. Yeah.
The lay people, entering into awakening.
Okay, I mean, this is a question that should really pertain to a different level of teaching when we come to that. So I just will be very brief here. According to the Buddha scheme of the 4 stages of liberation, which I'm not going to explain, but then that lecture gets a lecture intended for the later part of the course comes now. But there are 4 stages of liberation. The final stage is the stage of Arhat. Lay people in the Buddha's time quite often attain the first 3 stages. Sometimes they would even attain the 4th stage, the stage of Arhat. But once one attains that, if it's not at the point of death, then one naturally seeks ordination as a monk or a nun. After attaining arhatship, then one doesn't continue to live as a householder.
I was just curious, you started today saying that early councils by them were conducted with monks and not nuns.
Yeah.
And I was just curious because maybe it's the times back then, but people went to discuss the 7 kinds of wives, and it goes on in the next page, and it says, one without anger, afraid of punishment, who bears with her husband, free of hate, who humbly submits to her husband's will. And there's another...
I was going to come to...
You didn't come to it yet, so I
Yeah.
just one wondering.
I was hoping to cover section by section, so that if we were to deal with that question now, I would be sort of over-anticipating.
Okay, I'll ask later.
Okay. I just wanted to ask questions relating to what I've said so far. But I do want to move on. So unless there's some really pressing question that needs clarification. Okay.
I just want to make sure I understood on the Dhamma. Is it correct to say that the Dhamma is really a feature of the universe? It's not some entity within the universe?
It's not an entity within the universe, but it's the element of lawfulness which sort of underlies the workings of things, the workings of phenomena.
Which can be compared to like physical laws, say, of gravity.
Yeah, we could say even that the law of gravity, if there is such a natural law, would be a reflection of Dhamma at the level of physical or material events. An aspect of Dhamma at the level of physical events. Okay, unless there's some question about something that needs clarification, then I want to move on. Is there any such question?
Not really a clarification, however, I was just wondering with the story about Sunita, who was a ninja and he was considered an outcast because he was different and so forth. Isn't every type of work sacred? Even though society shunned him.
Well, you see, in Indian society, in a way, every type of work was regarded as something to be done as a sacred duty, but there was a very, very clearly defined hierarchy of types of works. And the work of collecting the excrement was assigned not even to the lower caste within the caste system, but to those who were outside the caste system, those who are considered outcasts. Okay, I want to go on now, because within the section on welfare and happiness here and now, we see a large number of teachings are concerned with family relationships. And from the viewpoint of early Buddhism, or even more generally of Indian spirituality, society is an emergent entity which comprises smaller units in such a way that the general character of the society reflects the qualities of these constituting units, the constituent units. So we can say that society, for example, of a country, of a nation, will reflect the character of its communities. The character of the community will reflect the character of the families that make up that community. And then the character of the family will reflect the character of the individuals who constitute that family. And so we can say that for Buddhism, the task of social transformation or of social reformation ultimately depends on bringing about changes in the individual people that constitute the society. And these are changes that should lead from moral negligence or unethical behavior to moral virtue or ethical behavior, from selfishness to generosity, from competition and efforts at domination to cooperation, from narrow-mindedness to open-mindedness, from ignorance and wrong views to right understanding and proper wisdom. Okay, but even though social transformation ultimately depends on changes in the individual, the lines of causation within the fabric of society are very complex. It's somewhat like waves on the surface of a lake, where there are complex forces or pressures on each wave impinging upon it, the complex pressures impinging on each wave from all of the other waves. And so there are complex vectors or forces impinging upon a person from different angles. And thus, while social progress depends on bringing about positive changes in the individual person, and individuals' character, attitudes, and so on are molded by the society in which that individual lives. And so we come to the question or problem, how are positive changes to be made within a society? And for the Buddha, one key, very important key, was the home environment. That children are molded and influenced by their parents. And so the home environment should be one in which children learn the basic virtues of respect, kindness, concern for others, sympathy with others. It's the responsibility of the parents to impart these qualities to their children, and children in turn should try to repay the kindness of their parents. And so thus we have in texts starting on page 118, some texts on the family, the relation of children and parents. And so the Buddha here is using, again, he's drawing upon ideas that would have been familiar to people from the wider Indian context. And he says that those families dwell with Brahma. Brahma was the supreme god of the Brahmins. Those families dwell with Brahma, where at home the parents are respected by their children. Those families dwell with the ancient teachers, the teachers of the distant past, the wise teachers of the past, where at home the parents are respected by their children. Similarly, those families dwell with the ancient deities, and they dwell with the holy ones, where at home the parents are respected by their children. And then the Buddha says that each of these Brahma, ancient teachers, ancient deities, the holy ones, this is a term for father and mother. And why is this so? Because parents are of great help to their children. They bring them up, feed them, and introduce them to the world. I know many people in America say that this doesn't agree with my family experience, since sometimes children here have difficulty with their parents, and parents don't always fulfill their right responsibilities to their children. Perhaps that was the case also in ancient India. I don't think that this is something unique to America. But I think we have to understand here that the Buddha is speaking within the understanding of a properly regulated family. And then the Buddha says that there are two people that one can never repay. That is one's mother and father. And he says that no matter what one might do for one's mother and father by way of taking care of them, looking after them, even if you were to carry them around on your back for years and years, even if you were to establish them as the supreme lords and rulers over the earth, one would not be doing enough to repay your parents. Again, because parents bring up their children, feed them, and introduce them to the world. But then the Buddha says that there are ways that one can repay one's parents. And he mentions 4 qualities. He says that if one's parents are without any faith in spiritual values or spiritual ideals, then one might settle and establish them in faith. One's parents might not observe any of the principles of morality. And so if one established them in moral discipline, in the precepts, if one's parents are stingy, miserly, then one encourages them and teaches them how to be generous, to practice generosity. And if one's parents are ignorant, then if one guides them to right understanding, to wisdom, in that case, the Buddha says, such a person does enough for his parents, he repays them, and even more than repays them for what they have done. Okay, and then for specific duties that children should do to their parents and parents to their children, you'll find that on the handout on worshiping the 6 directions. Okay, now we'll come to husbands and wives, the marriage relationship. And this is emphasized because for Buddhism, a healthy and wholesome home environment depends on the relationship between husband and wife. The marriage should involve mutual affection and respect between husband and wife. They should be united with affection and respect between them. Now, in the Buddha's time, marriages came about in different ways. Probably many marriages were arranged, as is done in Sri Lanka sometimes today, and in India today it's still very common for there to be arranged marriages. Sometimes 2 families that know each other will arrange for their son and daughter to become married. Sometimes they could be distant members of the same family, second cousins who were brought together and married. But also in India in the Buddha's time, there were love marriages. It wasn't always arranged by the parents. Another method of marriage is called Swayamvara, which means one's own choice, self-choice. If parents have a girl that they want to marry, sometimes they will announce this, and then young men will come forth who want to marry that girl, and they present themselves to her. Sometimes it could be at a contest even, where they have to show their skill in athletics, sports, wrestling, boxing. No, I don't think they had boxing. Wrestling, archery. And then after each of the suitors has made his presentation, the girl will report to her parents which young man she prefers to marry. And sometimes it's done in the opposite way. The parents of a young man will announce that he's eligible, and then parents who have girls to be married will come forth and they will bring their girls, and the girls will present themselves to the young man. maybe they will, not sports, but singing, dancing, I don't know the details. And then the young man will choose which of the girls he wants to marry. And it might seem that from these methods of marriage, apart from love marriages, that the marriages will not have much chance of success. But from what I hear, what I heard in Sri Lanka, very often when there's an arranged marriage, it turns out to be quite a happy marriage. And though the man and woman marry not through the attraction of passionate love, but through something that's arranged from the outside, but in their marriage relationship they develop true feelings of love, affection, and respect for each other. And the marriage can turn out to be quite happy. Sometimes it doesn't turn out that way, but the same thing happens with love marriages. Okay, but what the Buddha emphasizes is not the method in which the marriage should be carried out, but what are the qualities that the husband and wife should bring to the marriage relationship? What are the qualities that they should develop in the course of the marriage? What he emphasizes is that there should be especially care, respect, admiration, and solicitude for the well-being of the others. And that both parents should bring to their relationship a shared dedication to the task of preserving the family traditions and bringing up the children in a wholesome, ethically enriching and uplifting environment. And so here I've selected a few texts on marriage and relationships between husbands and wives. These begin at the lower part of page 119. One time when the Buddha was traveling along a highway, then a group of married couples came to see him, and then the Buddha explained to them, perhaps they were newly married couples, so the Buddha explained to them 4 kinds of marriages. He calls this a wretch marries or lives together with a wretch. A wretch, this is a low, vulgar person, lives together with a goddess. A god lives together with a wretch, and a god lives together with a goddess. And so, the case when a wretch, what makes a person a wretch? We have here that, for example, the husband is one who doesn't observe any of the ethical precepts. He's one who kills, steals, engages in sexual misconduct, who speaks falsely, and uses intoxicants. Okay, so that shows the absence of moral, of ethical integrity, ethical purity. Then this one is immoral, of bad character. That just sums up the result of not observing the 5 precepts. But this is the person who dwells at home with a heart obsessed by the stain of stinginess. That is, and he abuses and reviles ascetics and Brahmins by having the heart of stinginess. Again, that's another bad quality. And abusing and reviling ascetics and Brahmins shows the absence of respect for any kind of spiritual values. The opposite of this, let's say the ideal marriage, is when a god lives together with a goddess. That's the 4th one, where both the husband and wife observe the 5 precepts, and they are virtuous of good character. So we have ethical goodness, moral goodness as the quality of husband and wife. They are both generous. They dwell at home with a heart free from the stain of stinginess. So they are ready to give, they are generous in helping others. And then they do not abuse or revile ascetics and Brahmins, because they have respect for people leading a religious or spiritual life. Okay, so those are qualities of a good, morally uplifting marriage. And then in the next sutta, the Buddha is speaking to a married couple, a couple who had been married together for many, many years, and they had a very close, loving relationship. And both of them were sotapannas, or stream enterers. They both had reached the first stage of enlightenment. But even though they've reached this first stage of enlightenment, but they still have a very strong feelings of love towards one another. They've not yet become completely detached from feelings of emotional love. And they want to be together not only in this life, but also in future lives. And so they come to the Buddha and ask how they can be assured of coming together and being united in future lives. Then the Buddha teaches them that they should have the same faith, observe the same moral discipline, they should both be generous, and they should both have the same kind of wisdom. Okay, when that happens, then this will be a kind of, at least a strong supporting condition for them to come together in future lives. Okay, the third text on marriage this arises from a particular incident. The Buddha's foremost lay patron was named Anathapindika. He was the one who established the monastery where the Buddha stayed most often, the monastery in the city of Savatthi. And so one day the Buddha went to visit his supporter Anathapindika, and in the house there was a big racket and commotion coming from one of the other rooms. And Anathapindika said to the Buddha, "Don't pay any attention to her. This is our daughter-in-law. Her name was Sujata. She came from a wealthy, high-class family, and she doesn't show any consideration for her in-laws, for her father-in-law, her mother-in-law, not even for her husband. But she's very argumentative, very bossy, domineering. And she doesn't have any kind of respect for ascetics, not even for the Buddha." Okay, so the Buddha called, maybe Anathapindika was trying to tell the Buddha, don't pay any attention to her, let her just continue in this way. But the Buddha wanted to transform her. And so the Buddha said, "Call her, let her come and I'll speak to her." So then she came to the Buddha, and then the Buddha explained to her 7 kinds of wives. He says, one is like a slayer, a murderer. Another is a wife who's like a thief. Another is the wife who's like a tyrant. And so far we could understand that Sujata has been the one who's like a tyrant. Then there's a wife who's like a mother, a wife who's like a sister, who's like a friend, and who's like a handmaid. And I have to be very honest that the Pali word here, dasi, it's translated handmaid, that's a little too euphemistic. but dasi means slave girl. Okay, then the Buddha explains the qualities of each in the series of verses. Then he says that the types of wives called slayer, thief, and tyrant, these kinds of wives with the breakup of the body will be reborn in hell. While the types of wives who are like mother, sister, friend, and like a handmaid, or like a female, like a slave girl, steady in virtue, long restrained, with the body's breakup, go to heaven. And then the Buddha says to Sujata, these are the 7 kinds of wives. Now, which of these will you be like? And then she says, from today on, Venerable, you should consider me your wife, who's like a handmaiden, a slave girl. But what I say in the note, I'll say here. First, we have to understand that that is somewhat coming from the Indian background. And also it's quite fortunate in Buddhist countries which have developed without a surrounding influence from Brahmanism, like Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, maybe now Taiwan. But maybe the Confucian influence has been strong in old Taiwan also, so it's different. But these countries, Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, women have not fit into that subsidiary role, subordinate role of being like a handmaid or a slave girl. But women are quite strong, independent-minded, quite open. They can be quite outspoken in these societies. And can play even quite prominent roles in national affairs. Like during the time I was living in Sri Lanka, the country had a woman president and a woman prime minister at the same time. Our United States hasn't even yet had a woman president. Now we have a woman secretary of state. Okay, now I'll ask if there's any questions on anything that we've covered concerning the family. Parents in relation to children or husbands in relation to wives. Okay, let us take... There are 2. We could take each of those. Both
I
of
was
them.
just wondering, in child parenting section,
Yeah.
how does a child help their parent learn those things that Buddha was saying there, if the child was not brought up with them himself?
This does happen. It becomes more difficult for the child to acquire these qualities if the parents don't have these qualities, since the home environment plays a very important role in molding the character of the child. But it does happen that a child will come from a family where these, let's say, these values are not given much regard, but just on the child's own, the course of the child's own development. As the child reaches maturity, it might see the importance of observing codes of ethical precepts, the value of generosity. It might come to appreciate the principles of wisdom, and through that it will gain faith. What's meant here especially is faith in the Buddha and his teaching. And so then the child will try to transform. Now the child is not a little child anymore, but maybe a young man, young woman, will try to influence the parents and transform them. And there are cases that we read about in, say, the narrative Buddhist literature where this happens.
Hi, in light of last week's lecture about scrutinizing and finding a very worthy teacher, how do we reconcile these teachings from a man who abandoned his wife and child and was unable to encourage his wife to become Buddhist?
Okay, we think of these teachings coming from a man who abandoned his wife and child. And if you just take this expression, abandoned wife and child, completely out of context, it sounds like a terrible thing that he's done, like he's left them in the lurch without any means of support. Again, I have to say first we have to understand this partly from the Indian background, where first the quest for enlightenment and liberation is considered the highest, most worthy quest, which takes precedence over all other quests. One's ultimate responsibility is to find that truth which will be enlightening and liberating. The Buddhist tradition has developed the idea that the Buddha went out to seek enlightenment for the welfare of the whole world. And we do find some indications of that, hints at that, even in the oldest discourses, though this idea is not brought out very explicitly. But we could consider that the Buddha would have had some understanding that he was not an ordinary man, not an ordinary person, and that his own enlightenment is going to be for the welfare and benefit of many, many other people. Now, the Buddha did not grow up in an isolated family, what they call this, the atomic family, nuclear family, is that the expression? Nuclear family, not atomic family. But families in the Buddha's time were extended families. And the Buddha's own family was a royal household in the state of the Sakyan Republic. And so the Buddha's wife was a princess. Her son was a prince. And so they're going to be living at a very, very high standard of security, of their material well-being will be completely taken care of. The Buddha, after his enlightenment, returned to his native city, Kapilavatthu, and he met his wife and child again. And when he came to Kapilavatthu, his wife saw him coming out the window with her child, who is now 7 years old. And so she said to Rahula, the son, "Do you see that man at the head of this group of monks? That is your father. Go to him and ask him for your inheritance." And so when Rahula saw the Buddha, he went up to him and he said, "Even your shadow, ascetic, is pleasing to me. My mother said that I should ask you for my inheritance. Please give me my inheritance." Then the Buddha paused and thought, "Shall I give this boy material things that are subject to corruption, that are impermanent, and ultimately without any lasting value? You know, things like jewelry, crowns, royal robes, and so on? Or should I give him the gift of the deathless?" So then the Buddha thought, better that I give him the gift of the deathless. And he turned to his chief disciple, Sariputta, and said, "Sariputta, get that boy ordained as a novice." So then Rahula was ordained as a novice monk, and then he grew up and became an arhat, a liberated one. Then his wife, Yasodhara, eventually became a bhikkhuni, a Buddhist nun, and she also achieved enlightenment. And so the ultimate effects of the Buddha's renunciation was to bring both his wife and child, as well as many others within the Sakyan clan, the clan to which he belonged, to bring them to enlightenment. Okay. Additional question, one here.
So, I mean, just to go back to this 7 wives thing.
Yeah.
In a sense, that one has to use one's own judgment. You can't really look at this as this is very relative.
Very what?
Relative.
Relative.
I mean, one has to use one's judgment in terms of.
One has to use one's judgment, but for a woman, I say, don't judge. If you use your own judgment, don't select 1, 2, or 3. And also, I have to say, I don't really feel so comfortable with number 7 either.
But at the same time, the man, in the fact that women at that time and even now, they were very mistreated by their in-laws, and there were a lot of things that were going on in the society. And for a woman to then have to read something like this, which basically says, yes, you must stay in that position, doesn't really do much for her, you know.
I'm not so sure that it's encouraging women to remain in a subordinate position. In fact, the woman could choose the role of being the mother, being mother-like, in the sense of having solicitude for the well-being of her husband, or she could be like a sister, very, or like a friend, both of them on a very equal level.
That depends on the man. You know, there are men who are very used to this. It's very difficult in certain situations to adopt those roles. And when you read something like this, I come from that society, so...
You come from?
I come from that society, so I know it kind of firsthand.
Yeah.
That this is something that one walks away from because one feels that this is just another prescription to be further used.
That could be the case, but also I think we have to remember that the Buddha would also be teaching men who are husbands and giving them guidance how to relate to their wife. So one looks at in the worshipping the 6 directions, how should a husband worship the Western direction, that's his wife, by honoring her, by not disparaging her, by being faithful to her. And the 4th one, by relinquishing authority to her. That means in the household, the Buddha says, the husband gives the authority in looking after the household to the wife. And then also by providing her with ornaments or with gifts from time to time. So I would say, like, the ideal Buddhist conception is one of a fair degree of equality between husband and wife, or mutuality between them. And I don't think Indian society was particularly bad during the time of the Buddha, even quite apart from Buddhism. I think this extremely dominating role that came to be assigned to the husband in relation to the wife, and the subordination of the wife to her parents-in-laws came perhaps several centuries later when Brahmanism became dominant again, and then formulated the codes of conduct binding on the whole society, especially through a document like the Manu Smriti, the laws of Manu.
Yeah, I had the same kind of questions about that earlier. A lot of it was cleared up, but there was a statement about the wife being agreeable to the husband, and you did start the talk about the early councils of the monks, were by the monks to, and I was just wondering how the Buddha looked upon it at that point. I mean, women could get enlightened equally. I mean, was there any kind of I'm just asking how the Buddha thought about them women talking about them, because at the time
Yeah, I don't see any statement in the Buddhist text saying that a man has I don't see any statement in the canonical Buddhist text, the Nikayas, saying that a man has a greater capacity to reach enlightenment than a woman. The Buddha was hesitant, according to the text, was hesitant about establishing an order of nuns. He was approached by women. They asked him to establish an order of nuns. He rejected that request several times. But this is not because he thinks women are less capable of achieving enlightenment than men are. But I think we have to understand the Buddha's position here is the head of an order of monks who are committed to a life of renunciation and celibacy. And now he was probably afraid. One thing is that if you have an order of nuns alongside an order of monks, then there's the risk of them having close contact, and then feelings of affection, emotional affection will arise, and then there'll be many dropouts from the Sangha. The former Venerable so-and-so, Venerable Monk so-and-so, and former Venerable Nun so-and-so are now Mr. and Mrs. Devendra or Raja Vikrama or whatever. That's one thing. Another consideration would have been that in the very early days, the Buddhist monks lived a life largely of wandering, spending large periods of time in forests, and then just going on alms round to villages. And so it would have been quite difficult, the Buddha would have thought it's quite difficult for women to live a life like that. And it would have subjected them to certain dangers living in the forest. But eventually the Buddha was pressured, and then he agreed to establish the order of bhikkhunis, order of nuns.
I have another question, okay? This whole idea about parents and talk about parents who without faith, we should try to teach them, show them precepts. And it's my understanding, or if you can clarify for me, in my journey at this point, that people, you're trying to teach people, you're trying to show people the way, they have to be somewhat even open to it. As I walk with people who I approach.
Yeah.
And I know for sure my parents was entirely closed off, so at what point do you try to teach someone who's not open to it?
Yeah, this is a good question. In my opinion, if the parents are very closed off, it's not wise, and especially if they show a kind of hostile reaction, if you try to present them with Buddhist ideas, even if you don't call it Buddhism, but they just close off and turn against you, don't try. Because then it's just going sometimes to establish them in their position even more deeply than they're already in it. Because they feel that we are the parents, we're the ones who know best. What is my son doing preaching to me? I'm the one who should be teaching him. And so they'll react against it and then become even more entrenched in their position. But instead, just without any preaching, treat the parents with gentleness, with loving kindness. And one could do if you do the loving kindness meditation, you could make special object of the parents. And sometimes one could, through the force that develops in one's own mind, it can subtly, at certain subtle levels that are not immediately perceptible, influence the mind of one's parents. Okay, maybe we'll have time to see if there's another question. Okay.
I was going to comment actually on the question you just asked.
Yeah.
In my experience, I was raised in a Christian family, although we didn't necessarily practice it. It was just kind of unspoken that we're Christians and we follow Christ. When I became Buddhist, my family knew nothing of Buddhism and kind of just it's a cult and things like that. And I didn't try to turn anyone around. But an interesting thing that's happened lately is that my mother came to me within the past few weeks and mentioned that the change that she'd seen in me from my practice, and came to me wanting to know about Buddhism. And I gave her some books, and she's reading them.
Okay. Yeah.
So, whereas when I first went through it, I tried to, this is right, you have to read this. I don't think it would have worked. So I think that's one of the ways that it can turn around is you don't even have to try. They can see that you're bearing. But I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and that also answers the question that was brought up earlier from somebody in the back. Somebody in the back had asked, how can the child influence the parents if they don't have those qualities to begin with? There's an example of how it happens. Okay, the question in the back. Maybe that will have to be the last question.
Well, in other texts, one talks about having a calm, abiding mind and wisdom. And sometimes when I read these stories, or I try to understand why the Buddha did these things, it doesn't look like a calm, abiding mind to me. It doesn't look like wisdom. When you go over the issue of gender disparity and wisdom, that's when I have a struggle, but I want to. And I had struggled to get over that. Again, it goes back to finding that great teacher and hoping that the Buddha is how do you. If I'm judging them against the calm, abiding mind, I say, well, maybe you can.
Wait, what was the expression that you used?
Calm, abiding, I'm trained.
Calm, abiding mind, okay.
And I think, well, maybe enlightenment wasn't steady there, and I don't mean to be irreverent at all.
Yeah. No, I understand that. I have to say that there are some suttas that come in the canon which are disparaging of women. I'm actually doubtful that they come from the Buddha himself. I mean, some of them I just can't imagine coming from an enlightened person. But all I say is, put them aside. Whether the Buddha could have been, to some extent, influenced by the Indian background, the Indian attitudes, even with enlightenment, that's also a possibility. I mean, I don't even completely discount that possibility. But what I just think that's important is the content of the enlightenment itself. Okay, we will stop now. We'll end with the sharing of the merits. Maybe the people on this side, do they get? Everybody has? Okay. So we will recite these verses to share the merits with the Devas, the Nagas, dragon spirits, the Bhutas, the fair spirits, requesting them to rejoice in our merits and to protect the true Dhamma, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang param. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe deva anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhuta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe sutta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagupadaya avici hetato etantare satakai upapanna rupi arupi cha asanya sanyino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibbuttim.